It is my pleasure today to introduce our keynote speaker for the winter gathering. We're honored today to welcome Dr. Ryan Emanuel, a Lumbee hydrologist and a community engaged scholar from North Carolina. Dr. Emanuel's work at the Duke River Center focuses on connections between humans and water. It explores ecohydrology, watershed science, environmental justice, and indigenous rights. Before joining Duke, Dr. Emanuel was a professor at North Carolina State University, where he earned the Alumni Distinguished Graduate Professor Award and the University Sustainability Award. He's a fellow of the National Humanities Center. He actively collaborates with tribal governments, indigenous organizations, and his work has influenced policy regarding energy, food, water, and sustainability. He was awarded the Steve Wing International Environmental Justice Award and received the Distinguished Service to Indian Education Award from the United Tribes of North Carolina in 2019. This year, he was a finalist for the Phil Reed Environmental Writing Award for his book On the Swamp, Fighting for Indigenous Environmental Justice, which also highlights issues related to people, rivers, water, and indigenous rights. This book has been recognized as a valuable resource for those working with tribes on environmental and cultural resource management. The book was also selected this year for the North Carolina Reads Program and the Summer Reads Program at Duke. Beyond his academic work, Dr. Emanuel coincidentally was an alumni of the University of Virginia, and so at times spent a fair amount of time as a whitewater paddle instructor on the James River. And this is a point where we both share a passion. This is a river in my backyard as well. And so although we haven't paddled that together, I look forward to that day. Today, Dr. Emanuel will present a talk, Whose Watershed? Reimagining Indigenous Land Acknowledgement for Engaged River Science. Sorry. Please join me in welcoming, with virtual applause, Dr. Ryan Emanuel. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much, James, for that kind introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. Hopefully everyone can see that.
Indeed, yeah.
Okay, great. This is a new kind of talk for me, and I'm really excited to share with you all, and I'm going to leave some time as well for discussion, and I would welcome your feedback. So with that in mind, these are the ancestral lands of indigenous peoples who have stewarded it since time immemorial. How many of you have heard a phrase like this before? I'm imagining most of us have. Those of you who are in academia or adjacent to it likely recognize this as the archetype language for indigenous land acknowledgements. I'm not here to convince this group that it's important to understand and articulate the significance of indigenous peoples' territorial claims, whether those are historical claims or present-day claims. I will assume that that is understood in this group. Instead, I want to spend some time unpacking the idea of an indigenous land acknowledgement in a little more detail, thinking about where they come from, what risks are bound up in their creation and dissemination, and how to pursue the development of these statements responsibly. I'll also offer some of my own observations about things to avoid. Along the way, I'll tell you a little bit more about my work, and I'll share some experiences that I hope will provide useful illustrations. I know that I won't be able to answer all of your questions on this topic in 30 minutes. I probably couldn't answer all of them if we had several hours together, but I really hope to equip you with some ideas and recommendations that can help you make decisions about whether and how to engage in the practice of indigenous land acknowledgements in your own work. And first, I want to emphasize that words are powerful and they can have strong effects on people and situations. This is especially true for land acknowledgements. And I'll start right off the bat by sharing a quote from my book, On the Swamp, about the seriousness of land acknowledgements. So, this quote, these are the ancestral lands of. That phrase carries both the truth and trauma that can slip past uneducated ears. Indigenous homelands on the coastal plain are places of deep connection and remembrance, but there are also places where traumatic colonial experiences befell our ancestors. That trauma still flows through our communities today. The pain of racial oppression and cultural loss combines with the traumatic transformation of our homelands, and it haunts us from generation to generation. That quote is from the first chapter of my book, which calls on readers to first recognize that land acknowledgements do have power to cause harm. And I ask readers also to reimagine land acknowledgements as opportunities to sit down and actually learn something substantive about Indigenous peoples and their relationships to the places where we each are. That chapter is a reminder that there is always more below the surface, and it uses stories of my ancestors and other indigenous peoples of the coastal plain of present-day North Carolina to illustrate this idea. The chapter also emphasizes that truth telling is an integral part of healing and reconciliation in colonized places. And, the idea of truth telling is not new. It featured prominently in South Africa's emergence from apartheid, and it's been part of ongoing reconciliation efforts around the world, including notably Australia, where Indigenous peoples have been at the forefront of developing a practice of truth telling as a healing and reconciliation process. So, to further illustrate, Reconciliation Australia, a leading non governmental organization in this area, recently published a report of case studies to highlight the critical importance of truth telling to reconciliation efforts between Indigenous and non Indigenous Australians. So the quote here, the community truth-telling initiatives detailed in this report show that an experiential rather than a didactic approach to truth-telling is crucial. Here, learning occurs through creating immersive experiences rather than focusing on facts alone. These experiential engagements are deeply inspiring for non-Indigenous communities as well as First Nations communities and can provide a powerful motivation for non-Indigenous communities to participate in truth telling. I pulled this quote because its focus on the experiential nature of truth telling seems really apt for a group like this that shares what I assume is a common interest in immersive learning experiences. And moreover, both of these quotes focus on the power of truth telling. And if you take nothing else from this talk, I want you to understand that despite criticisms that we'll talk about later, Indigenous land acknowledgements are powerful because they engage with this idea of truth telling that's really the heart of reconciliation efforts worldwide. And these efforts themselves are part of a broader push towards Indigenous rights, which include the right for Indigenous peoples to tell their own stories and to share them with other people. And for better or for worse, when you engage with Indigenous land acknowledgements, you're situating yourself inside of this complex system. My work engages with land acknowledgements because I work in a university setting where they're increasingly common, and also because my research deals partly with issues of Indigenous rights around land and water. But that's not all of my work, and that's not even the work that I was originally trained to do. I am trained as a hydrologist and have spent nearly 30 years working in this field in some capacity. I started out as a hydrologic aide at the USGS in the 1990s, working on EPA stormwater permitting monitoring in Charlotte and urban flooding issues. After studying hydrology in undergrad and grad school, I created a research program in ecohydrology and watershed science, which focused mainly on coupled carbon and water cycles in forested watersheds. Most of that work took place at Tenderfoot Creek Experimental Forest in central Montana and at Coweta Hydrologic Lab in western North Carolina. And after working for 3 years at a predominantly undergraduate institution, Appalachian State, I moved to North Carolina State University, which is one of our two land grant institutions, where I spent nearly 12 years before moving to Duke in 2022. Over the years, several different hydrology courses have been part of my teaching rotation, including a summer field course in mountain ecohydrology that I co-developed and co-taught as an early career faculty member. And most of my other courses have had some kind of field component ranging from afternoon labs near campus, to weekend camping trips, to paddling excursions. And once or twice a year, I join groups of middle school and high school students on paddling trips where we talk about the science and the history of rivers a little bit, but mostly we just have fun. And all of that's to say that I spent a lot of time thinking about rivers, wetlands, and other watery places as learning environments, as I'm sure many of you have. Um, my thinking is informed not only by my work as a hydrologist and as an educator, but also through my identity as a Lumbee person. I grew up very close to my homelands in what is now Eastern North Carolina, and I'd never lived further away from home than Virginia. And as a result, I've spent my entire life in and around the main stem of the Lumbee River and its tributaries, which is our ancestral waterway, and it's the waterway with which we share our name. And you can see a shot of it here on the screen. My mother's family comes from the Lumbee community of Sandy Plains, which, as it sounds, sits on a broad, flat plain in between two tributaries of the Lumbee River. My father comes from Saddle Tree, a community named after the nearby Saddle Tree Swamp, which is yet another tributary of the Lumbee. These are all blackwater streams that flow through the coastal plain. This is flat and smooth water. It's the color of richly steeped tea. It's flanked by beautiful floodplains with river birch and black gum and bald cypress. And these rivers and their surrounding wetlands and the uplands, interstitial places make up a mosaic landscape that to me is just beautiful beyond description, and it's my home. In fact, no matter where Lumbee people may live, most of us will tell you that this is the place we call home. And when I take my students out on these waters, one of the very first things I tell them is that this is my ancestral home. The river and its wetlands are bound to my people through centuries of history and culture. My people treated this obscure sliver of our large ancestral territory as a refuge. In fact, we began to gather here about 300 years ago, following more than a century of colonial violence. We built farms and communities on the interstitial uplands between the swamps, and we maintained our kinship networks even as we continued to interact with the outside world. My ancestors benefited from the swamp's reputation as a frightful, malaria-ridden wasteland, and we were largely ignored until the coming of railroads in the mid-1800s. Not long after that, a small band that was led by Lumbee hero Henry Berry Lowry, who you can see on the right here, used the swamps as a home base to wage a 7-year guerrilla war against white supremacists who held power in the region at this time. And I tell my students these stories with all the enthusiasm that I would use to tell them about dissolved organic matter that colors the water, or the sandy bed forms that are slowly marching downstream. These are the facts and the stories that I learned about my people and our connection to the river. And I encourage my students to remember these stories, to learn more about them, and to share them with other people. And I still do the same basic thing with my students today because it helps them to understand what we mean when we talk about cultural connections to water. It helps make indigenous knowledge understandable and relatable as a form of information that helps us understand how these places function both hydrologically and socially. And that's also what I try to convey to readers throughout my book. So I consider a form of privilege to have these kinds of stories in my head and to be able to call them up at any moment. And it's a kind of expertise in and of itself. And as an insider, I have a right to use these stories in a way that outsiders may not. And that difference between insiders and outsiders is one reason that many formal land acknowledgement statements exist in the first place. These statements take complicated relationships between indigenous peoples and their homelands and encapsulate them into a form that outsiders can understand and appreciate. And so I want to pivot now and take a closer look at these statements. Specifically, what can we learn by looking at something like the definition of land acknowledgements? Here, I'm going to lean on my book again to say that one way to define formal land acknowledgements are brief oral or written declarations that identify specific indigenous peoples, here again, past and present, who claim ties to a specific place. Well-researched and respectful land acknowledgements instruct, and they also invite meaningful reflection and action. Universities, museums, governments, and other institutions sometimes use land acknowledgements to affirm existing relationships with Indigenous peoples, or they use aspirational language to remind themselves of how these relationships ought to be. And so, although there are forms of land acknowledgements found throughout cultures all over the world dating back to ancient times, this modern notion of a land acknowledgement dates to the 1970s in Australia, in connection with Indigenous rights movements there. That practice spread to other nations, including Canada and the United States, in the decades that follows. I want to draw your attention to two highlighted characteristics of land acknowledgements that I think are incredibly important. They instruct and they invite action. Critically, to instruct, these statements have to be factual. They should include relevant details about the indigenous peoples you're talking about. A general statement that this is native land may be entirely true, but it's fairly basic in terms of a teachable moment. It's like student on a field trip asking where water in the river comes from, and you, the instructor, says the sky. While that might be true, by itself, it's not an answer that teaches anything useful, and it certainly doesn't speak to the complex hydrological processes by which precipitation becomes stream flow. I also think that if we're going to bother with land acknowledgements at all, we should consider a call to action. A call to action is something that's often missing from these statements, but I think that it's an important aspect. That action could be as simple as telling other people what you learn about the indigenous peoples who call some particular place home. And to this end, I think we can actually learn something from the Coast Salish practice of calling formal witnesses from outside the community to participate in noteworthy events, such as here the Swinomish tribe's annual blessing of the fleet. It's an honor to be chosen as a witness for something like this, and that honor comes with responsibilities. Indigenous journalist Kelsey Kalona describes the witness's three responsibilities as never forgetting what they saw, take every opportunity to talk about it with others, and follow through with work that needs to be done. You could think about this list of responsibilities as a minimum call to action by a land acknowledgement. There are great examples of more specific calls to action, including highlighting local indigenous nonprofits, particularly that are involved in land-based practices like conservation, river keeping, gardening, etc. Better yet, let your land acknowledgement tell people specifically how they can support these initiatives. Share a link, share their Cash App. The point here is that land acknowledgements can teach factual information and they can call people into actions that help advance the priorities of the very people that you're acknowledging. So, with that advice comes a few cautionary notes. Land acknowledgements can certainly cause problems if they're not prepared and delivered with appropriate care and attention, including contextual information that actually matches the situation in which the land acknowledgement is going to be used. However, the biggest problem that I've seen with these statements is that they can perpetuate inaccurate information. This particular problem bloomed a few years ago when web-based land acknowledgement tools became really popular. In general, these sites weren't developed with the knowledge or consent of indigenous peoples, and in some cases, they contained information that was factually incorrect, misleading, or oversimplified. I have many examples of this, but I'll share one particular one with you here. So for many years, one of the popular sites shown here on the screen misrepresented indigenous territorial claims where I live in North Carolina. In fact, I'd never heard of this site until one year on Indigenous Peoples Day. I began to see local teachers in my school district announcing on social media that they were on the traditional lands of a present day tribal nation who had never lived in this part of the Southeast. This was a big deal for me because I'd served on both local and statewide advisory committees for Indigenous education, and I'd spent years presenting to school groups, to groups of school administrators, and to school boards, and even helped the state's Department of Public Instruction create an online continuing education course for teachers so that they could learn about North Carolina tribes. So in the moment, it felt much like that work was washing away as people flocked to this newly popular but incorrect resource. So I eventually got in touch with the website's owner and explained the situation, which also required me to track down the source of the error, document the mistake, and pointing them to information that would correct the map. I didn't want to do this, and really I didn't have time to do it, but the alternative was to see this error reproduced over and over again by educators. And these are people who would eagerly share this information with their own students, thinking that they were doing something positive. Soon after our conversation, a splash page appeared on the website containing a disclaimer about the accuracy of the information. The disclaimer's wording has changed slightly through the years, but the key message has remained the same. Check with the Indigenous peoples in question before you use the information from this website. Unfortunately, I don't think many people heed this disclaimer because I still see erroneous land acknowledgement information being shared today. And most of the time, I can trace it to this website or another website. So the cautionary lesson here is that if you're going to use some kind of website like this purporting to delineate Indigenous territorial claims, just treat it as a starting point for your research and not an ending point. Use the same caution that we would give our students about Wikipedia years ago. Sometimes it's a good place to familiarize yourself with a topic, but never hang your hat on what you read there. Interestingly, the well-known Lakota scholar and activist Vine Deloria Jr. foresaw this situation in his 1969 book, Custer Die for Your Sins, when he lamented the proliferation of what he called, quote, easy knowledge about Indians. And what Deloria meant was that easy knowledge tricks us into thinking that we don't have to do the hard work of the witness to remember the story, to tell other people about it, and to do the work. With web-based tools, we can trick ourselves into thinking that someone else has done the work on our behalf, and we don't have to remember or repeat because that information is always at our fingertips. In other words, the only work we need to do is to look up the name of a tribe or group on a website and make sure we pronounce it correctly when we're giving our land acknowledgement. So that thinking has led to widespread criticism of land acknowledgements as ineffective and frankly performative. Critics typically agree that these statements have little to no value unless they're accompanied by action. And some critics think that land acknowledgements even distract altogether from the more important work of returning land that was taken from Indigenous peoples. These are important and valid criticisms that we have to keep in mind if we're going to use these statements. I would say in reality, sometimes these websites are okay, and there's no question or controversy about whose homelands they show. But when the websites get it wrong, users run the risk of spreading incorrect information, misdirecting their calls to action, or frankly offending the people that they're attempting to honor. I don't think the creators of these sites have bad intentions. In fact, I'm convinced that they support efforts by Indigenous peoples to maintain ties to their homelands and to assert sovereignty in other ways. But I do think that these products, as handy as they are, create a sense of false certainty. So my recommendation here is to always check the information with a tribal government's own website, with official publications, or with resources created by tribal members who have expertise and authority to share it. Here's a summary of some ways that you can find reliable information. First and foremost, seek out tribes and indigenous organizations in your area. and attend public events. Of course, there are events that are only attended by members of that community, but in general, any event that you find advertised is open to the public. Show up, learn about the issues that are important to that community, network, and find out how you can support that work. There's really no better way to gain reliable information about Indigenous peoples, territorial claims or otherwise, than just show up and start building relationships. Beyond that, if you're someone who's based at a university, is there an American Indian Center or Indigenous People Center on campus? These sometimes support students, sometimes they facilitate community engagement, oftentimes they do both. If your university doesn't have one, first ask why they don't, and then find out which universities in your region do have them. These are resources. Tribal government websites often have information about historic and present day territorial claims. My note here is that these are not always maps. Sometimes they're in narrative forms. For example, the watershed of a specific river. That's something that we can map and delineate ourselves if we wanted to. Tribal governments may also have authorized publications in libraries or sometimes even in bookstores. Indigenous non-tribal organizations may have the same. And Indigenous scholars sometimes publish peer-reviewed work or other reports about their own communities, and these can be useful sources of information. Many states, like North Carolina, have intertribal commissions, and their websites have valuable information about tribes in your state. They're like clearinghouses. Note that because of forced removal, you may have to consider other states besides the place where you're currently looking. For example, if I were interested in central or northern West Virginia, I know that that area was at minimum claimed by Shawnee people. But because of forced removal during the 19th century, the Shawnee Nation is presently based in Oklahoma, along with dozens of other tribal nations that were removed from their homelands. Finally, and this may or may not be useful, environmental impact statements and environmental permitting documents can contain detailed information and even public correspondence between environmental regulators and tribal officials that may include details about ancestral or present-day territorial claims. These environmental assessments and associated documents for the Dakota Access Pipeline, for example, are full of information about present-day tribal nations who claim territory along that pipeline route. I label this one as a wild card because you never know what you're going to find in these documents. Sometimes it's nothing at all. If this seems like a lot of work, that's because it is. None of this is easy, but I would argue that it shouldn't be easy. Developing a useful land acknowledgement that instructs people and calls them to action requires the same level of care and attention that we give to lesson planning or any of our other professional responsibilities. If you do decide to go down the road of developing or revising a land acknowledgement for your institution or for a field course, ask questions like, what am I hoping to achieve? How much time can I realistically devote to preparing and disseminating this? Can this information be threaded throughout the course or the field experiment? And what do I actually need to get it right? And so these and other questions should spur you to think about this as a deliberative process. And part of the process is thinking about whose job all of this is. Ultimately, those of us who teach students, this is our responsibility as instructors for the content that we share in our classes or on field trips. And speaking of students in general, I would say don't offload the work of creating land acknowledgements to Indigenous students. I'll caveat that by saying some students would welcome the opportunity to engage in this work, to do the research, and to create something that they could be proud of. And that's great. Let those students come to you. But as an instructor, I wouldn't ask them to do the work of speaking on behalf of their own community or on behalf of Indigenous peoples more generally. In broad terms, if you ask an Indigenous people to, or if you ask an Indigenous person to give a land acknowledgement, you may learn something by listening to its delivery, but you will bypass another learning opportunity of doing the work yourself by outsourcing it to someone else. And so, when is it okay to approach an Indigenous person for help with the land acknowledgement or similar work? To answer that question, I want to talk for a moment about a professional role that some scholars have labeled the boundary spanner. These are individuals who work at the interface between Western and Indigenous knowledge systems. Marco Hatch and colleagues, in a paper that was published in 2023, call them the fulcrum facilitating collaboration. I love that phrase. These are not simply academics who happen to be Indigenous. These are individuals who have committed their careers to the long game of building and maintaining strong and mutually beneficial relationships between Western scientific institutions and Indigenous communities. Notably, they have expertise in both areas, and they're often considered insiders in both worlds. You're likely to find them engaging in academic discussions and engaging in the life of their community. And in many cases, you'll find them studying and publishing about this interface as an area of research in its own right. So when you encounter boundary spanners, I would argue that it's fair to engage with them about your efforts to create a land acknowledgement or your decision about whether or not you should even pursue one. Land acknowledgements essentially occupy the same interface where boundary spanners work. And so, in my opinion, as a boundary spanner myself, asking me about land acknowledgements is not much different than walking down the hall and asking your aquatic ecologist colleague about mayflies. The answer could be very simple, but it could also be a very complicated beginning of a longer conversation or even a long-term collaboration. I don't know that every boundary spanner will share this view, but I think it's okay to ask. Just don't wait until the last minute, because that also reduces the possibility of integrating Indigenous perspectives and knowledges more deeply through your course or your field trip. So I'll start wrapping up by giving you some additional considerations that I thought about while I was preparing this talk. I think that it's clear to me that meaningful land acknowledgements emerge from relationships. The best statements that I have seen speak to the substance of meaningful connections, connections between Indigenous peoples and their territories, and connections between Indigenous peoples and ourselves or the institutions that we represent. Learning about Indigenous people's relationships to rivers can deepen our perception of these systems. Land acknowledgement should not be the end of our efforts to teach and to learn about the deep connections that Indigenous and also non-Indigenous people share with rivers. Think about land acknowledgements as part of a larger theme of teaching about rivers as socio-environmental systems. Also, practice humility. Some knowledge can't be shared, or it's been irreplaceably lost. You may not always get an answer to a query about Indigenous territorial claims. And we have to be forthright with our students about why that is the case. In some cases, colonial records have overlooked or erased Indigenous peoples from history. And we got to be honest about this, because that's also a teachable moment. I've written more about this kind of humility in a recent piece that was published in Bioscience, and I'll just leave it at that. I will end on an encouraging note, just to say that you can actually do this and do it well, but it's also important to keep these things in mind. Land acknowledgements can help or they can harm, so be responsible. And again, there is no easy knowledge, so put in the work. And do build relationships and let the statements follow those. And this is probably the best advice I can give you. Whether you're working with a boundary spanner or some other community member, focus on building authentic connections around the needs and priorities of the community, and think carefully about the ways that you can responsibly leverage your resources and knowledge and expertise for their benefit. Have those conversations, build a strong working relationship, and the land acknowledgement wording will flow readily after that. Thank you very much.